welcome to your deep dive. Today we're going to be exploring um, this book, The Jewish Revolutionary Spirit, and its impact on world history.
Yeah, this book really digs deep into how Jewish people and communities have been involved in revolutions and these different ideologies throughout history.
Yeah, and we've got some interesting stuff to unpack here.
Definitely some controversial stuff, too.
Yeah.
We'll be looking at how this history kind of connects to the bigger picture and what it all means, like, for us today.
The book starts off pretty strong. It claims that the very definition of what it means to be a Jew, that's actually changed over time.
Yeah, the author really highlights how there was this shift from a mainly religious identity to a more like ideological one. And this particularly happened after Christianity kind of came onto the scene.
They use examples like the Bar Kokhba revolt to illustrate this point. Was that the one where they were looking for like a very different kind of Messiah?
Exactly. We see Rabbi Akiba proclaiming Bar Kokhba as like the Messiah. But this time around, the whole idea of a Messiah wasn't just about, spiritual salvation. And they wanted a leader who could actually overthrow Roman rule.
Wow.
Yeah.
So the Jewish community was looking for someone who could lead them to victory against their oppressors.
Right. The book suggests that this shift towards a more militant and politically focused Messiah really reflects a growing revolutionary spirit in parts of the Jewish community.
Okay, so then what was the relationship like between those early Christians and Jews, like during this period?
Well, the book gets into sources like the Gospel of John and writings by some of those early church fathers like Origen and Chrysostom and uh, let's just say it wasn't exactly a friendly situation.
Yeah, I mean, Chrysostom didn't hold back at all. He called synagogues a risk to the faith, and he even accused Jews of, all sorts of things.
Yeah, and his words were really, really harsh, reflecting a lot of the tension at the time. The book kind of portrays Chrysostom and some of these others as seeing the Jewish rejection of Christ as like a rebellion against God and against the established order.
Wow.
They even went so far as to blame rabbis for stirring up hostility toward Christians.
Things were really heated.
Oh, yeah.
And the book seems to imply that this tension kind of played a role in shaping later events like the Spanish Inquisition.
Yeah, the Spanish Inquisition was a really dark period targeting not just Jews, but also conversos, who were those Jews who had converted to Christianity but were suspected of still secretly practicing Judaism.
Yeah, forced conversions, accusations of heresy, and eventually that expulsion of Jews from Spain in 1492. Just a terrible chapter in history.
It is, and the book actually specifically mentions people like Pedro the Cruel, who was actually known for being pretty tolerant towards Jews, and then you have Pope Benedict III, who tried to convert Jews through these big theological debates at Tortosa.
Wow, so do you think all this persecution actually fueled the revolutionary spirit that we're talking about?
It's certainly possible. The book points to the emergence of these messianic figures like Shabbai Zevi in the 17th century, who actually claimed to be the Jewish Messiah and promised deliverance for the people.
Right. But his movement didn't exactly have a happy ending, did it?
No, unfortunately, Shabbai Zevi ended up converting to Islam under a lot of pressure, which left his followers incredibly disappointed. But his story, I think, reveals a very deep yearning for change and liberation that continued within the Jewish community.
It sounds like this yearning for change was also tied into those broader revolutionary movements happening in Europe, particularly during the Reformation.
That's a really key connection that the book makes. It traces the influence of figures like Johann Reuchlin, this German scholar, who actually defended the Talmud even when others wanted to see it destroyed.
He argued that understanding Jewish texts was really important for Christian theology. That must have been a pretty controversial stance back then.
Oh, it was. It really put him at odds with people like Johannes Pfefferkorn, who wanted the Talmud completely burned. This whole controversy played into the larger upheaval of the Reformation, with figures like Martin Luther and Thomas Müntzer challenging the authority of the Catholic Church.
And didn't Luther himself have a really complex relationship with the Jewish community?
Yes, he initially advocated for tolerance, but later on became much more critical. And then you have Müntzer, who actually became a leader in the German Peasant War, preaching this really radical social and religious revolution.
So these threads of religious and political rebellion were closely intertwined.
Very much so. And the book even suggests that someone like John Dee, advisor to Queen Elizabeth I, was influenced by Jewish mysticism, specifically Kabbalah.
Like John Dee, the one who was like obsessed with magic and talking to angels.
The very same. The book suggests that his interest in Kabbalah shows this broader trend of Sephardic Jewish influence in England and the Netherlands at the time.
So you're saying Dee's interest in the occult was actually connected to these larger currents of Jewish thought and revolutionary ideas.
The book presents that as a possibility for sure. It kind of paints this picture of all these seemingly unconnected events like the Reformation, the rise of the occult, and the influence of Jewish intellectual traditions all playing a part in shaping Europe's revolutionary landscape.
It's really amazing to think about how all of these things can come together to influence history.
Absolutely, and that's really just the beginning. The book goes on to explore the rise of Freemasonry and its connections to Jewish mysticism and revolutionary goals.
Now we're getting into something really intriguing. Freemasons' secret societies, whispers of hidden knowledge. It sounds like something out of a thriller.
Well, the book digs into those very themes. It highlights figures like Isaac Newton, who, aside from his scientific brilliance, was also really into alchemy and biblical prophecy. It also discusses John Toland, a pretty controversial thinker who advocated for religious tolerance and really challenged traditional Christian doctrines.
So the book suggests that these intellectual giants were actually involved in Freemasonry, and that their involvement was driven, at least in part, by ideas rooted in these Jewish mystical traditions.
Yeah, that's one of the book's more thought-provoking arguments. It proposes that these Masonic lodges, with all their emphasis on secrecy and ritual and enlightenment, provided fertile ground for spreading these ideas.
And these ideas, in turn, fueled revolutionary sentiments.
Exactly.
And then it connects this to Napoleon.
It does. Napoleon Bonaparte, the French general who became emperor. The book examines his relationship with the Jewish community, his really big emancipatory policies, and his fascination with Jewish history and symbolism.
Napoleon actually granted Jews equal rights, and he even dreamed of liberating Jerusalem. That's a huge difference from the persecution during the Inquisition.
It's a really dramatic shift. The book suggests that Freemasonry played a big role in shaping Napoleon's worldview and his vision for a new social order.
It's so fascinating how all these separate things come together
It is.
to shape history. But the story doesn't stop there, does it? The book also looks at this rise of the Jewish revolutionary in 19th century Russia, and that seems like a very different environment.
It is, and we'll get into that next, and you'll see how this thread of the Jewish revolutionary spirit continues to weave through history.
Okay, so we've got Napoleon's secret societies and this brewing revolution, and now we're moving on to 19th century Russia.
Right.
So, what was happening over there?
Well, the book really digs into Tsarist Russia and this thing called the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment. And it's really interesting how, in some parts of Europe, the Haskalah led to assimilation, but in Russia, it actually seemed to fuel revolutionary activity.
Oh, wow, that's interesting. Why would the Haskalah have such different outcomes in Russia?
Well, the book points to the fact that even though Russian Jews were getting exposed to this secular education and these Enlightenment ideas, they were still facing a ton of discrimination and were confined to the Pale of Settlement.
So they were getting like a taste of freedom and equality, but they were still treated like second-class citizens.
Exactly. It created this whole generation of young, educated Jews who were just completely disillusioned with the Tsarist regime. And it wasn't just about escaping persecution. They wanted to create a society that was more just and equitable.
So were conditions for Jews in Russia just like significantly worse than in other parts of Europe?
Well, the book points to a few things like Tsar Alexander II, who, started some reforms but then kind of backtracked, and that led to more repression. And then you had the pogroms, these just violent attacks on Jewish communities, and that just further radicalized a lot of people.
So it's this combination of, intellectual ideas and oppression and violence that led to this revolutionary fervor.
That's what Thick is getting at.
It mentions people like Lev Dyke, who formed these revolutionary circles in cities like Kiev, and Isaac Aronchik, a member of that revolutionary organization, Narodnaya Volia, which even used terrorist tactics.
Right, and his failed attempts to actually assassinate the Tsar just show how intense the struggle was.
Wow.
Yeah, it was a completely different situation than, say, the Glorious Revolution in England.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
The stakes were way higher in Russia, and the methods were a lot more extreme.
The book even quotes this guy Drumont, a French anti-Semitic writer who saw Jewish involvement in the Russian Revolution as this, deliberate attempt to undermine the Russian people.
Yeah.
That's a pretty extreme take.
It is.
I mean, wasn't there a lot of debate back then about whether Jews were actually, disproportionately represented in these movements?
There was. And the book doesn't shy away from that. It presents evidence from a ton of sources, Jewish and non-Jewish, and acknowledges that Jews did play a significant role in the Russian Revolution.
Okay.
It even quotes Lenin himself thanking Jews for their contribution to the Bolshevik cause.
So it's not just some conspiracy theory.
No, it uses real evidence to support the idea that Jewish involvement was pretty undeniable.
So why were so many Jews drawn to these movements? Was it just to escape oppression, or was there something more?
The book explores both the social and ideological factors and suggests that, along with escaping persecution, many Jews saw these revolutionary movements as a chance to create a more just society, one that upheld, values like equality and social progress.
So it was a combination of self-preservation and a genuine desire to make things better.
Exactly. And the book argues that this revolutionary spirit wasn't just confined to Europe either. It shifts its focus to America and the impact of Jewish immigrants on political and social movements there.
Okay, so that's an important shift because it brings the story closer to home.
Right. It connects it to the issues that we're dealing with in the present.
The book covers a lot of historical events, starting with the Leo Frank case, a really controversial murder trial in Atlanta that really fueled anti-Semitism. And then it delves into Jewish involvement in the Communist Party and the rise of organizations like the NAACP and the ILD.
It's amazing to see how all these organizations came together to fight for racial and social justice.
And they often had overlapping memberships and goals, right?
They did. And the book doesn't just paint this rosy picture. It explores the complex and sometimes really difficult relationships between these groups, highlighting figures like Walter White, a leader of the NAACP, and Angelo Herndon, a young Black communist organizer who faced a ton of persecution for his activism.
It sounds like a period of immense change with all these groups trying to figure out the way forward.
It was.
Is there anything in particular that you found really striking in this section?
One of the most interesting parts is how the book looks at music, particularly folk music, as this vehicle for spreading revolutionary ideas.
Music has always had that power
It really has.
to inspire people.
Absolutely.
It's amazing how a song can become like a rallying cry for social change.
The book traces the influence of figures like Woody Guthrie, Pete Seeger, and Bob Dylan, connecting them back to those earlier folk traditions and their role in popularizing protest music.
And it highlights the role of Jewish musicians and promoters, right?
It does. It discusses figures like Albert Grossman, Bob Dylan's manager, who was really instrumental in promoting Dylan's music and cultivating his image as this voice of his generation.
It's interesting to think about all those people working behind the scenes
It is.
to make those changes happen.
The book argues that this whole musical tradition, which has its roots in both Jewish and African American experiences, provided a powerful voice for those fighting for social justice and equality.
It shows the power of music to bring people together.
It really does.
And the book goes even further. It concludes by looking at Philip Roth's controversial novel Portnoy's Complaint and explores its themes of Jewish identity assimilation and the defiance of traditional values. Portnoy's Complaint. That's a book that definitely caused a stir.
It did. Roth's novel, with its exploration of sexuality neurosis and the complexities of Jewish American life, was really controversial.
Oh, yeah?
The book argues that Portnoy's Complaint reflects the changing social and sexual landscape of the late 1960s, and that its themes of rebellion and defiance resonated with the revolutionary spirit of the time.
So it's not just about historical movements and political ideologies. It's also about how those revolutionary impulses show up in art and literature.
Exactly. It suggests that Roth's novel, while fictional, really captures the rebellious and iconoclastic spirit of that era.
As we're wrapping up this deep dive, I'm struck by how relevant these historical threads are to the conversations we're having today.
It's fascinating how the book encourages us to think about the lasting power of ideas and how they shape both historical events and our individual lives.
Okay.
It pushes us to examine our assumptions and recognize that history is complex, particularly when it comes to identity, religion, and political activism.
One thing that really resonated with me was that discussion of the Vatican II Council in the 1960s.
Okay.
The book really dives into the church's evolving relationship with Judaism, which is a topic that is still very relevant now.
Yes. That section highlights the ongoing efforts at reconciliation between these two faith traditions. The book points to figures like Jules Isaac, a French Jewish historian, who advocated for the church to acknowledge its role in fostering anti-Semitism.
But it seems like there was some resistance within the church, right?
Absolutely. The book mentions figures like Bishop Carley, who maintained that Jews were responsible for Christ's death. So it reminds us that even within the same religion, those historical narratives and those theological interpretations are constantly being debated.
And that these issues are still very much alive today.
Exactly. We're still grappling with questions of religious freedom, historical injustices, and the role of different faith communities in society.
And the book really tackles these questions head on.
It does.
It discusses the rise of organizations like NARAL and its advocacy for abortion rights. And it puts that in the context of this larger cultural shift that was partly influenced by individuals with Jewish backgrounds.
Right.
It's a very sensitive and complex topic.
It is. And it's important to remember that the book is offering just one interpretation of these events. There are other perspectives out there, but its aim is to get people thinking and to encourage readers to engage with these challenging issues.
And it does a good job of that.
It does.
After this deep dive, I'm left wondering, where do we see echoes of these revolutionary impulses in our world today? Are there any modern-day equivalents to the figures and movements we've been talking about?
That's a great question. The book gives us a framework for understanding the historical roots of these ideas, but it leaves it up to us to make those connections to the present. Think about all the debates we're having today about social justice and identity politics and the role of religion in society. Do you see any parallels to what we've talked about?
This has been an incredible journey. The Jewish revolutionary spirit has given us so much to think about, from ancient religious disputes to modern cultural upheavals.
It really challenges us to think critically about history, about identity and the lasting impact of ideas, and it reminds us that the past is never really past. It shapes who we are and the world we live in.
And it leaves us with some really big questions. How do we balance individual freedom with social responsibility? How do we navigate all the complexities of religious and cultural differences? And how can we be a force for positive change in a world that is constantly evolving?
Those are the questions we need to keep asking ourselves. This deep dive has given us the historical context, but the answers are going to come from how we choose to engage with these issues in our own time.
Well, thank you so much for taking us through this fascinating exploration. I hope our listeners are feeling as intellectually stimulated as I am.
It's been my pleasure. I always enjoy digging into these complex topics and uncovering the hidden connections that shape our world.
And to our listeners, keep those questions in mind. The journey of discovery doesn't end here. This is just the beginning. It's amazing how this book connects all these seemingly random things, from those ancient religious debates to modern social and cultural shifts. It's like a giant tapestry, where every thread plays a role.
Yeah, and it really encourages us to think about how powerful ideas are and how they shape history and individual lives. It challenges us to really examine our assumptions and recognize that history is never simple, especially when we're talking about identity and religion and political activism.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I'm particularly struck by how relevant all this historical stuff is to what we're talking about today.
Yeah, that's one of the things that makes this book so interesting.
I mean,
it's not just about the past, it's about understanding the present through the lens of history.
One thing that really stood out was the book's discussion of the Vatican II Council back in the 1960s. It really goes into the church's changing relationship with Judaism, and that's a topic that's still very relevant now.
Yeah, that section highlights those ongoing efforts and the tensions sometimes in trying to reconcile those two faiths.
Right.
The book talks about people like Jules Isaac, a French Jewish historian, who really pushed for the church to acknowledge its role in fostering anti-Semitism.
It seems like there was some pushback within the church, though.
Yeah.
With some people holding on to those traditional Catholic teachings.
Oh, yeah. There was, for sure. The book mentions people like Bishop Carley, who maintained that traditional view that Jews were responsible for the death of Christ.
Wow.
So it's a reminder that even within the same religion, you have these historical narratives and theological interpretations that are always being debated and challenged.
And that these issues are not over and done with.
No, they're not.
We're still dealing with questions of religious freedom and historical injustices and the role of different faith communities in our society.
Right. And the book really dives into those complexities.
It does.
It talks about the rise of organizations like NARAL and their advocacy for abortion rights, and puts that into the context of a much larger cultural shift that was influenced in part by people with Jewish backgrounds.
That's a really sensitive and potentially controversial topic.
Yeah, it is, and it's important to remember that this book presents one interpretation of these events. There are other perspectives out there, and it's important to engage with those different viewpoints. The book's goal seems to be to spark thoughtful discussion and encourage readers to grapple with these really complex issues.
It definitely does that for me. After this deep dive, I'm left with a lot to think about. I mean, where do we see those revolutionary impulses playing out in the world today? Are there any modern-day equivalents to the people and movements we've been talking about?
That's the big question, isn't it? The book gives us this framework for understanding where these ideas come from, but it leaves it to us to connect the dots to the present.
Yeah.
Think about the debates we're having right now about social justice and identity politics and the role of religion in society. Do you see any parallels to what we've been exploring?
I mean, this book has given us so much to think about, from those ancient religious disputes to modern cultural upheavals. The Jewish revolutionary spirit has really expanded my understanding of history.
It challenges us to think critically about history, about identity, and the lasting impact of ideas. It reminds us that the past is never really past. It shapes who we are and the world we live in.
It really does, and it leaves us with some really important questions. How do we balance individual freedom with social responsibility? How do we navigate all those complexities of religious and cultural differences? And how can we be a force for positive change in a world that's constantly, grappling with progress and conflict?
Those are the questions we need to keep asking ourselves. This deep dive has given us the historical context, but the answers are going to come from how we choose to engage with these issues in our own time.
Well, thank you so much for guiding us through this fascinating exploration. I hope our listeners are feeling as intellectually stimulated as I am.
It's been my pleasure. I always find it rewarding to delve into these complex topics and uncover those hidden connections that shape our world.
And to our listeners, keep those questions in mind. The journey of discovery doesn't end here. This is just the beginning.